from last time. So as we saw in the Android framework, in order for storage, you have three different methods of storing information. One is shared preferences, which I talked about last time. I'll talk briefly about flat file based storage, and then we'll talk more about the SQL database. And then I will also take this opportunity to introduce you to content providers. Content providers are a way of, one of the components in Android. We already saw activities, we saw services, we saw the broadcast receiver. The last one, content provider, I will introduce today. So, getting to this particular one. So I have already covered shared preferences. So everybody understands shared preferences, right? Now, one of the places where you would make use of shared preferences is for storing preferences like settings for your application. And in order to support you to develop settings for your application and so on, the Android framework provides you with this thing called as user preferences and the preference activity. Preference activity is a subclass of activity and primarily devoted to allowing you to design user preferences screen, settings screen, as you might want to call it. Okay? So setting user preferences for an application is supported through this activity class called preference activity class. So this activity class, obviously, if you need to do settings, for example, or solicit users' preferences for the application, you need to make use of the screen where the user can select things on the screen, right? So if you need to make use of the screen, what is the Android component that supports the usage of the screen or the UI? It's an activity. Activity is the only one that can directly display the things on the UI and so on. So that's the reason why this preference activity is a subclass of the activity class. And what the preference activity does is it provides you with a method of specifying the settings screen or the preferences screen in XML format. Just like the way you specified a typical layout of the screen in XML in standard Android, preference activity takes an XML file called a menu file and then constructs the screen using the description that is available there. Okay, so if you need to add preferences to your application, you create a file called preferences.xml, for example, in this directory. You can name it other names if you want. You need to give it a unique name. I called it preferences.xml in the example that I will give you in the lab next week. You create a new activity called preference activity, and then this will read the default preferences from the XML file above. I'll show you the structure of the preference activity for the example that you will see. And then, since this is an activity, and an activity is a component of your Android application, you need to add the activity to your manifest file. And then you will invoke the preference activity just like you invoke any other activity. So you need to issue an intent in order to start that activity. Now, fortunately, we have a method of providing user menus within Android. I'll briefly talk about menu, although I don't have any notes about it, but I'll show you with an example how you would create menus or user menus for different items in Android. And then we'll see how we can seek users' input. So let me show you that with an example. What I have done is I have taken the example that you have been seeing so far and then extended it to provide user preferences and so forth. So let me start up this activity. I should okay, that should start up the emulator. Now, as the emulator is starting up, I'll show you methods of adding menus and items onto the screen for seeking users input. Now, first and foremost, you do realize that many of the older Android devices have got a dedicated button called the menu button, right? Which is always present on older Android devices. If you buy the newer ones, the menu button has been removed, so no longer do we have a hardware menu button on the newer Android devices. Indeed, in fact, most of the items that you normally see as hardware buttons have been shifted into the software lower bar on the newer Android devices and so on. So the older devices have a button called as the menu button. On the emulator, you would see it with the name menu on the screen. And for different devices, depending on the kind of device that you have, the menu button may have one or more names associated with it. This is an old device, obviously, and so it has a menu button. This button is called the menu button. So that button would be used to invoke menus from the screen. The preferred way of doing things nowadays is to include such kind of items directly into what is called as the action bar, which is on top of the screen in the newer, for example, Android ice cream sandwich and other applications. Okay, let me see. Okay, this. Emulator is running into problems. So when it comes up, I'll explain to you what can be done. So in this particular example, what I do is create an options menu for the user to use. And how do I specify the options menu? In this case, for my example application that you have seen so far, I have created two menu items that will go onto the action bar. And I need to describe the two menu items that I will create. And for menu items that I create for my application, I can describe the menu items using, again, an XML format in this format. So as you see, my menu here contains two items. Item number one, which is called as an About button, which would be used to supply some information about the application that you're making use of. So that is where you would print some information about the application. You might have a help button, for example, for your application if you want to provide online help for your application. You will have something like a settings button, which the user can click in order to change or set up some settings for your application. So if in this particular example I have just two buttons, one called as the About button and the second one called as the Settings button. And as you would see in here, I describe the two items. I give each item an ID because I need to reference it in my application. Then I give it a title. This is a title, About, and Settings. And then I specify the corresponding icon for my application. If I don't specify an icon, what Android will do is simply put the title directly as the button. But obviously, if you have a small screen, putting a whole title, for example, putting settings on the screen will occupy a lot of space. So you would rather use an icon to represent this. So these are two items that I represent. And then this particular one, this particular statement, show as action, informs the Android framework saying, add these items into the action bar. What is the action bar? The action bar is the bar that is on the top in Android 4. From 3.0 onwards. Android framework provides this action bar, which occupies the top of the screen. I'll show you as soon as the emulator starts up how this is viewed. Now, once you declare menu items like these, And I'm sure each and every one of you, when you create your application, will need to use some sort of a menu to be provided for the user somewhere. Now, in this case, this item, if you want to provide these as buttons for your application, I think I have to restart my emulator one more time. So if you need to add these items into your application, in any one of the activities, if you want to add these items as a menu, then you need to declare two methods in the application. You have seen this particular activity called main menu. This is the one that displays the list of items on the screen in the application. Now in here, the way we make use of this menu items is as follows. This is called as options menu that you create on the screen. Okay. So what you would do is, once you created that XML file, the options menu, in your application, okay, there we go. Now, let me make it a bit more concrete by actually showing you where these items appear on the screen. Do you see these two things up there? Those are the two things that are created. This one, from Android 3 onwards, the top thing is called as the action bar. That is what you use to provide items in. The previous Android devices used to have this hardware menu button, and when you clicked that, it would bring up the items. But from Android 3.0 onwards, they no longer, the menu button is what they call as deprecated, which means that you are suggested not to use the menu button anymore. So we are suggested to make use of, so you see, if I click the menu button, nothing happens, because I am making use of the action bar for the purpose. If you were to develop the application for older devices, the way you declare it in the application is still the same, but in the XML file, I'll make the change and then show you what happens. Now here, you have these two buttons here. So if I click on the first one, this is called as the information button. So it just displays some information about the application. You have all seen about items in your application. What is the second one? The second one is a settings menu. And so you obviously see a wrench there. So if you click on that, it will come up with this image. This is controlled by preference activity and user preferences, which I was just explaining to you earlier. So I'll come back to explaining how you create something like this in a short while. And then I will also explain how I make use of shared preferences in order to store this information. Okay? Now, getting back, first and foremost, you need to allow the user to access this settings. So in order to provide that for the user, you need to create these options. So what I have done is, in this particular activity, you won't see these options menu on any other screens. So for example, if I click on that, you no longer see those items. They don't exist. They exist only for the main menu. Only for the main menu. The reason is because in the activity that controls this screen, I have declared two variables. Sorry, I have declared this particular method called as onCreateOptions. Okay? This method is what is used to specify that you need to provide the user with a menu. If you were doing this for a pre-3.0 device, the menu button would activate a call to this particular method. In post 3.0, those items will automatically go into the action bar, and then you can directly touch them on the screen. That's a better way of handling for post 3.0. But the code is still the same. The example that I created last year was relying on the menu button in order to invoke this. I didn't have to make any changes. I only needed to change the XML file with that extra option, and that basically allowed me to make use of the menu button, of the action bar directly. So in here, what am I doing? I am getting an inflator. Inflator is used to inflate an XML file. So after I do that, I inflate this XML file. You all know what this is. This is the reference to the XML file. And then I call that as a menu. And so this method, when it is invoked, it will create the menu buttons in the action bar. Okay? If you want the hardware menu button to function, what you can do is you can go into this and then remove this. If you don't provide these options, then the same thing is invoked. Now I will deploy the same application and then show you how the menu button invokes exactly the same thing. So going back to my application, when the application comes up, you will see you will not see those menu buttons on the screen, but instead when you get there, you don't see it. But the moment you click the menu button, you will see these two popping up on the screen. Okay? So pre 3.0 devices, if you want to support, all that you need to do is remove those two items from the menu XML file, and then it will pop up like this, and then it will act exactly like what you have seen there. This is exactly the same behavior when I click the About button, and similarly, when I click the settings, I see the settings screen. Now, obviously, you will ask, how do we come up with this? I will explain, because those are listeners for these clicks that you need to create. Now, so let me change back to the post 3.0 device so that it's more easier to show it on the screen. So I go back to this options menu file and then roll back the changes that I made.
How do you support both?
Sorry?
How do you support both pre and post?
You can't support both pre and post.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe there is a way of doing it. You need to, because this particular application, I am deploying it to a 4.0 device, because I'm using the version to be 4.0.3. If you use a 2.2, then there is a way of, if you declare that in a 2.2 version, then when you deploy to a 4.0 device, there is something called an overflow button that comes up on the bottom screen, which if you touch, it will invoke the options menu, and it will look more like what I've shown you with the change. Okay, so there is a way of working around it. So there is backward compatibility maintained, but the code itself remains the same. Code doesn't change. So going back to the earlier, the updated version, the reason I am not trying to show you the pre 3.0 things is that by the time you all come to develop applications to deploy on Android devices, 4.0 would have established itself as the dominant version of Android by then. Now already 2.3.4 is the most dominant Android version for devices being used by users these days. And by the time you graduate and then you start developing applications and deploying them, 4.0 would have established, because people would have replaced their phones by then. So that's why I'm not even trying to ask you to target pre-2.2 devices. I just ask you to move on to 4.0 plus devices. Okay? So this particular one is provided by using this particular method. Okay? So what do you need to do? If you need to provide options, menu items for the user, create the XML file and then use the XML file in this manner inside the activity for which you want to provide the menu. Not only this, when the user clicks on that item, you want to be able to handle the user's selection of the item, and that is done by using this method called onOptionsItemSelect. So when the user selects the item, this method is going to be invoked depending on which item you select. So here, what I am doing is, I have two buttons there, right? One is the About button, the second one is the settings button. So when the About button is invoked, this is the code. This is the handler, and this has to be declared in this method called onOptionsItemSelected, and then the parameter is the menu item. So this will be invoked by the Android framework, supplying this as the menu item. So this is used for you to identify which particular item the user clicked on the menu. So we had two options, right? Menu About and menu settings. These IDs you have declared in the XML file here, right? You declare the XML file, menu About and menu settings. So that's the reason why you're able to make use of them in this code. So if you say menu About, you need to implement the handler when the About button is clicked. This is the handler when the settings button is clicked. Now, when the About button is clicked, what I do is I pop up a dialog on the screen. So what you see, that little thing that pops up on the screen is called as a dialog. And how do you pop up a dialog? This is the method. So you need to create a dialog, and then you need to set up the dialog's layout. This layout is similar to the XML layouts that you set up for screens and so on, similar thing. And then set the title for the dialog, and then supply the information inside here. And then after you do that, when the About button is clicked, this part of the code will be executed, and that is what displays the dialog on the screen. Okay? More documentation for this, when you go to the lab next week, you will be asked to do this. So you will get to actually do it and see how it works. So this is for the dialog. When the settings button is clicked, what happens? You need to invoke the settings activity or preference activity named as the user settings. So what do I do? How do you start an activity? You need to create an intent. Okay? You need to create an intent, and then you start the activity corresponding to that. Okay? This you already know from your previous experience with the code. Create the intent and start the activity, and this is what allows me to display the settings screen. So when the About button is clicked, when the settings button is clicked, it will lead me to this particular activity. Now this brings me up to discussing how the user preferences can be handled and so on. So when I click on this, obviously the dialog, this for displaying this, I am using the dialog for displaying this. Okay, and so the dialog can be very much used in your applications. For example, if you want to pop out some information for the user, you can make use of the dialog for popping out information for the user. And when I click settings, the settings activity is involved. Now this is an activity, a extension of an activity class, preference activity class that I make use of. Now how is it done in code? So as I explained in this slide, as I explained in the slide, user preferences can be handled through this thing called preference activity. How is this preference activity declared and used in Android? For this, going back to the application, that is, the question to ask ourselves is, how am I creating this on the screen? For handling this, I make use of an activity that I declare called preferences. Okay? So as you saw, in this particular file, I started it by saying preferences.class. So obviously, you are expecting that preferences must be an activity type that has been declared somewhere. And this one is declared here in this file called preferences.java, which is an extension of preference activity. Okay. Now, when I create the preference activity, inside my preference activity, I do onCreate. So since this is an activity, it has to have the onCreate class lifecycle method declared there. Inside the onCreate lifecycle method, I invoke this thing, add preferences from resource, and then call this particular file. This is the file where I describe how my preferences are structured. Okay? We'll have a look at this file in a minute. So when this activity is invoked, it will use this XML file in order to create the preference activity on the screen. How do you create a preference activity on the screen? So we need to look at the XML file which specifies how this is done. Now this particular XML file is in this directory called as XML, obviously. So let's open this and then have a look inside to see what exactly is contained inside this XML file. Okay? This XML file describes the structure of the preferences screen. Okay? Let's look at the XML file, then we'll look at, okay, let me first show you the preferences screen, and then we'll come back to look at the XML description of it, and then from that we understand how this is done in practice. So what do you see here? You see basic settings, and then you have something called turn off splash screen, and then you have a checkbox here, which I can see here, but it's very hard to see on the screen, but there is a checkbox there. If you tick that, that means that you don't want the splash screen to be displayed. And then this select course is, when I click on that, it will pop up this one, and then it will allow me to select the course. Okay? And then user information will lead to yet another screen where the user ID and password can be typed in. Okay? If you have used a smartphone, you know how you make use of all these things. Okay? Now, how did I end up creating this in practice? Now, the structure of this is declared in this file called as preferences.xml. So now you saw the layout of the preferences screen. Let's look and see how this is created. The preferences screen has to be described in XML using that as the first statement. Okay? Beside that, inside, I will declare categories. This is one category of items on the screen. This is the second. This is another one. This is the second category, 2 items. The first category's title, I have declared it as basic settings. Did you see this word on the screen? Basic settings. That's how it comes up in the basic settings. What do I have there? I have a checkbox. You remember the checkbox on the screen there? This is the checkbox. So title for that, and then the default value, and to that. The second one is a list preference. List preference. In this list preference, I just select course and then this allows to select a course and then the default value and then the entries. That is, when I click on it, if I want to give you options like the radio buttons, I declare that inside this file called list array. Where is this file called list array? List array is a file that is stored in this directory called values. Inside the directory called values, I have this file called list array where I declare the choices. I have two choices and the corresponding values. So this is what a list array looks like, a string array. It's called a string array type. Looks like an Android. Okay? So this is how you declare. These are the two items and the corresponding values of those items. So this is how you create a list array. And this list array is made use of here. Okay? So if I have a bunch of items and allow the user to select one of them, I can declare them like that and then specify the values at the bottom there. So depending on which one the user selects. So this should always be constructed with a matching thing. So the items here should match the items here. So that way, when the user selects one of them, then the corresponding item from here will be used within your application. The second part was user information. Again, showing you the screen here. Sorry. These are the two items that I can select. Remember, these two are the items in the list array that you saw. All right? Now, obviously, I don't expect that you'll remember much of these, but I wanted to show you this, and then later on, when you see the same thing in the lab, you will be reminded of the fact that you have seen this before. That's the purpose. So this is one preference category. These two items belong to the first. This is the second one. And in the second one, when you click on this, it leads me to a second screen. So I can allow nested screens if I want to be supported. And that is supported in list activity by making use of this. So the second category, preference category, is user information. And then in here, I can declare a preference screen in there. And then I say preference screen and the user information. And then these are the two items inside the preference screen. So that is what is created on the second screen. So that sort of gives you an example of how you can create preferences for the user. All right? Questions? Now, obviously, this is just one example. I showed you a few constructs that you can make use of. If you were creating settings for your particular application, you can use this as an example to come up with your own settings. What kind of settings do you need for your application? That only you will know, right? You are the creator, so you know how to create it. So once you have declared this, then you are making use of this preferences.xml as the file in your preference activity. So that's why it says r.xml.preferences. You declare that. Okay? So that is your preferences file. Okay, now, once the user selects the items, how are you going to store these items? Where are you going to store these items? Now, this is done inside your, so this activity will allow the user to this activity is invoked by using this. All right, the settings activity here. Now, going back to how am I going to store this user preferences within my application? For that, I created this particular singleton class called as my settings, and in here I am making use of the first kind, which is shared preferences, in order to store this information. So inside here, again, the description explanation will be there in the lab manual that you will see in the lab next week. But basically in here, I have this class called my settings. In this class, I am declaring variables here and a string here, and then I will store my information inside my shared preferences. Last time I explained to you how to get shared preferences. So if I say get default shared preferences, this is the shared preferences that is common for the entire application. So this is the default shared preferences application. And in here, when I get the shared preferences, then I can simply store the preferences. How do I store the preferences? As a name value pair, key value pair. The key is specified for the first one and the value is specified for the second one. So I have 4 items that I get from my user preferences preference activity. The 4 items was splash screen, whether I ticked that item or not ticked the item. By default, I store true here, and the course preference by default is called 4521. The user ID and student ID by default is blank, but when the user sets these items, they will be stored in the shared preferences. Okay? Any questions? So these are the 4 items that I make use of.
But how?
Yeah.
How is this stored? How is this pref stored?
That is, you are asking, where do I store these items into these preferences?
Yeah.
Right? When you invoke the settings screen, those items will go into the shared preferences. Now, how do I make use of it? Going back to here, I can get hold of my settings and then get the preferences and then make use of them within my application. This is how I can make use of them. Now, how do they get stored here? In here, that is done by, let me see, we're all, this preference activity allows me to make changes to the shared preferences. This tells me that I can make the get default shared preferences gives me the default shared preferences file. So I expect these options to be there present in the default shared preferences file. So I would be storing them there. So when I invoke the preferences file like this here, and then I make changes, they will be saved into the preferences file. And the saving is done in terms of key value pairs. And as you saw, when I created the XML file, there is my XML file for the preferences. When I created the XML file, I specify the keys for each one of them. This is the key for the first one. This is the second key. This is the third key. Where is the third key? Third key. So those will go into the default shared preferences. So if I make any changes here, it will automatically be put into the default. The preference activity takes care of that. Okay? But if you want to explicitly make changes, you need to invoke the editor and then make use of the editor to make changes to the shared preferences. So that's another way of doing settings. But using user preferences is another way of making changes. The primary reason why I created this, this particular settings class is so that all my settings are manipulated in one single place. So I can directly query this one and then get all the information from here directly. Get preferences. If I call get preferences, it will return all these values from those and then initialize these variables. And then in here, so what I am doing is that I am manipulating and accessing the shared preferences from a single location. I can directly open this in each one of those classes, because what I noticed is that I need to make use of these settings in 3 different files. In welcome.java, I need access to this particular preference value, which is whether I should display the splash screen or not display the splash screen. So for this, I simply declare settings and get all of settings. If you declare a singleton class, if you need a reference to that singleton class in Java, this is how you can get a reference to it. Okay? This is Java stuff. If you don't know much about singleton class, don't worry. Use that as an example to help you to design it. Okay? Now, I need to make use of those preferences here, and then similarly, in each one of these files, for example, in contacts.java, I will need to access which particular course should I fetch the information from. So I have to query and then get hold of which course has the user selected, and then based upon that, I will decide which information I should display on the screen by processing the XML file. So in here also I need access to that. Similarly, now how am I making use of the course preference? So as you see, in this variable course pref is set to the specific course that I have selected, and I am doing that when on create, I am getting preferences and then setting up this variable. And then subsequently, when I open the XML file here, where do I open the XML file? Yeah, I open the XML file here, and so I need to make use of this course pref in there in order to construct the URL for the location from where I need to fetch the XML. So I make use of it there. So that way I will automatically manipulate which particular course, direct course website I am fetching this information from. So that's the reason. Several different activities need access to the preferences. So that's why I created a special preference class, special singleton class where I store all my settings and then allow each of these activities to go and query and get this information from. This is object-oriented stuff, nothing to do with Android per se. You can choose to implement it in a different way. That's fine. Okay, and so on. Okay, any questions? So in one single shot, I have modified the application and included several different things. One is how to create context menus, not context menus, how to create menus on the action bar, how to create preferences and user settings and so on. All these different things introduced in one single application. That's the reason why I kept changing the application step by step to introduce new features into it. Okay? Any questions? Everybody happy so far? Am I spending too much time explaining the code?
Yeah.
I am?
No.
So dry.
It is dry, yeah, it's partly dry too. That's the thing. Some people want me to explain the code, some people don't want me to explain the code.
No. I don't mean. I mean, it's pretty necessary to explain the code because If you just explain it, I mean, if you just really deal with the concept, I mean, you understand that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I will explain a little bit, and then if you need more explanation, just ask me to explain in more detail. So getting back to screen. So we saw user preferences and